Hi viewers, this is Nargis Zahra with the program Old Theatre with New Players. Another episode, another exciting topic of international politics and emerging world order. And we are honored to have Dr. Marvin Weinbaum with us. He's Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at Middle East Institute. And I welcome you on board, Dr. Marvin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That's an honor. So this is something very interesting being, unfold since September last year in this region, which has Afghanistan and Pakistan, the peace talks and the actors, the changing factors and all. So now that we have entered a phase of intra-Afghan peace talks, so what are the hopes that we can attach to a long-term peace in Afghanistan?
Well, I wish I could be optimistic here. I think what we have seen thus far is rather depressing. In this sense, we have now finally in Doha a meeting of the Taliban with representatives from Afghanistan. And of course, this is positive. We've been waiting a long time for this. However, what it has taken to get to where we are and the signs of what are now based on what is now happening in Doha, these are far less than promising. I'm afraid that everything we've seen thus far suggests that the very basis for a peaceful outcome, the very basis of a power sharing arrangement which somehow would allow the values of both sides to be reflected in the composition of a government, that all of the signs that we have suggest the impossibility of bringing this about, however much it is so desperately wanted by not only, of course, the people of Afghanistan, but by the whole international community, and especially the regional players. Mm-hmm. What I'm referring to is the fact that it took a year and a half for the United States to reach an agreement with the Taliban that even made it possible for Afghans to talk to Afghans.
Yes.
And the basis of that agreement was such that there really were very few items to discuss. The United States wanted to leave. It was said it's prepared to leave. And the only thing it was really asking of the Taliban is that if we leave, you will do two things. You will agree not to work together with groups like Al-Qaeda to provide them a platform in which they could attack targets in the West, not conspire against us. They also agreed, although this was not as important to them, that on the signing of this, they would enter into talks, intra-Afghan talks, which is what we've been aiming for. They wanted an exchange, something that they got by the very fact that the discussions with the U.S. was going on, and that was legitimacy. The kind of legitimacy that they could never have imagined a couple of years ago, where all the international community comes knocking on their door. They wanted something else, and this was probably the most important. They wanted to assure that the U.S. removed its troops, and with the United States would presumably go its allies in the fight against the Taliban. Mm-hmm. They also wanted very clearly out of this, and it was agreed to in their meetings took place in Doha, that there would be a prisoner exchange.
Yes.
5 for 1, the Taliban would get not just any 5,000 prisoners, but the ones that they specifically wanted most. And these, of course, turned out to be individuals who were accused of the most serious of the crimes, terrorism, by not just the Afghans, but by the United States and other countries which could claim that they suffered at the hands of the Taliban. Well, when an agreement was finally signed, it was only because the U.S. really caved in on all points. The U.S. agreed to leave, but it didn't have very much bargaining power because it had already indicated that it wanted to leave.
Yeah.
We did agree to give up. We couldn't give up the prisoners ourselves because they were being held by the Afghan government. And the Afghan government was not party to the discussions that we were having with the Taliban, much to their chagrin.
Yeah.
And so we committed them to doing so. And of course, they balked. They were not interested in this. They had no part in this. But in the end, through all of the year and a half of negotiations with the Taliban, they got everything they wanted. Everything they wanted, and gave up nothing because all they had to give up was a promise that they would not work together with Taliban and similar groups. They didn't agree to what we wanted so badly, and the Afghans above all, and that is a ceasefire. They would not agree to it.
Okay.
And they still have not agreed to it. It turns out from all the indications that we have from the UN, as well as our own intelligence, that none of the ties with the Taliban that have been so important to them, going back 20 years now, more than 20 years, have been severed. I don't know why we ever thought they would be. They have been working so closely together, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, all these years. The fact that because the U.S. asked for it, that they would simply write them a letter and say, sorry, those days are over. Now you're the enemy. Or if you're not the enemy, at least we want nothing to do with you. So all of this comes down to the fact that we're now find ourselves, after struggling to get to Doha, having experiences with the Taliban all this time. And what we have learned is they don't yield on anything. And more importantly, by standing firm, they give up nothing. They get everything that they want. As much as Ashraf Ghani complained, I won't give up any prisoners, then I'll give up 1,500, then I'll give up 3,500, and then finally he gave up even the 6 who were most thought of as having committed the most heinous crimes. He gave up, even though France and Australia complained so loudly, and the U.S. said nothing, because what the U.S. wants at this point, above all, is just to have a cover in which they can leave. They want and the cover is that there's an agreement, and that the U.S. can say, well, now that they're talking together, this is now Afghan owned, this is now their affair. They'll negotiate this. So that's where things are. We can then talk about, if you like, what this means for the region.
Yeah. Actually, the way I was thinking about it, The Talibans of 1980s who fought against the invasion of their country and against like Soviet Union, those were the Talibans. That's a different generation. Their motive was quite.
Those were the Mujahideen, not the Taliban, and there's a difference.
Yeah, but let me just explain where I'm coming from, because Talib means a student. So the rest of the image was related later, then it became a different phenomena, a negative thing, the negative connotations attached to Talibans. But to start with, yes, the Talibs became the Mujahids, like the ones who were into education. They had a perspective to save their own mainland against an invasion. But this is what people need to clarify categorically, that the Taliban's, the generation which went to violence and the heinous crimes in the 90s, that was a different generation. Those were tagged as Talibans, but their political ideology was totally different from the political ideology of the generation fighting in 1980s. So with that context, I think there is a concern of Pakistani government as well, that if there is a hasty, like ouster of the troops from Afghanistan, of allied or American troops, then it may, leave the borders more insecure. And then there is another thing. I want your opinion about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
What happened was in the 1980s, the U.S. and the Saudi Arabia paid for Pakistan to effectively take over the jihad. And the people who fought were a group of seven parties. These were not talibs. These were veteran politicians who led the Gulbuddins, the Rabbanis, the Sayyafs. These were figures well known in Afghanistan. What they gave is they created a how can I put this? A climate here of, if you will, of terrorism. And out of this, when the Mujahideen took over, then they fought among themselves. And out of that emerged a group which called themselves Talibs, students. These were people who most of whom had grown up in Pakistan. They were not part of the jihad. The leaders had jihad experience, but the rest were people who grew up in madrasas and went to school madrasas in Pakistan. And they came in and they inherited this kind of Islamic militancy that the Mujahideen had practiced against the Soviets and the communists in Afghanistan. So that's the link here. And that they didn't come until 1994, and then they took over the country. Now, Pakistan, as well as the other countries, but particularly Pakistan has a great stake in what happens, which is what you're alluding to. It has a great stake. What happens in Afghanistan is very important. Not just the fear that India is going to somehow use this as a base of operation to surround Pakistan, but also, that is there, but also that if Afghanistan is uncontrolled, if it in a state of war, this is bad for Pakistan. Chaos in Afghanistan is not good for Pakistan.
Exactly.
But in the 90s, when Pakistan fully supported the Taliban, it was the feeling that we know that, but we can control them. Once they consolidate power, we will be able to control them. This was the thinking of General Babar, who really was initially the sponsor of the Taliban within as interior minister initially. It wasn't the ISI initially. So Pakistan recognizes now that the outcome there not only will determine India's status in Afghanistan, but the stability of Afghanistan. And as I say, this has to be seen differently in today and since 2001, 2, 3 than it was in the 90s. Because when Pakistan looked at Afghanistan in the 90s, it saw it as perhaps a obedience government. They owed all of this to Pakistan, and Pakistan could feel very comfortable that they had friends there. Today, and for some time now, Pakistan has to look at Afghanistan and say, through different lenses, because now, since 2003, and Batullah Masood and his successors, the TTP, it, as well as its own militancy within the country, Islamic militancy within the country, including in the Punjab, of course, that what happens in Afghanistan is going to have an effect on Pakistan. In other words, they have to see Afghanistan through the lens of their own Taliban, of their own challenge from extremism. And that has changed so that Pakistan doesn't want, I believe, and I say this is true also for all the neighbors, they don't want now a monopoly of power by the Taliban. That's not seen in their interest. That's something to be feared. That whether they do it themselves or they allow others to do it, that a Taliban government there will create instability in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, even in Iran, because Iran always in the past had great difficulty with a radical Sunni regime.
A neighborhood, yes.
Yeah, and of course, India fears a strong Islamic state in the region, and Pakistan has to say, if the Taliban are in control, how is this going to play out in Pakistan? Is it going to energize? Will it energize the radical elements in Pakistan? Will they be able to operate out of Afghanistan and freely attack Pakistan, for example?
Yeah.
This is why Pakistan has the most to lose from a dire outcome in Afghanistan.
Yeah, perfectly. I really agree to this thing. And then there is another thing, that the interdependence, like despite the rocky track of the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the interdependence of economy and trade is something for which both of the countries, I think, are in need of compatible governments. And by compatible, I mean, yes, if there is a peace in your neighborhood, your trade is stable and your trade routes are stable. And that leads to developing indicators of economy on both sides of the borders. My question, it's like another curious question, where does Qatar comes in? Because I can understand why Pakistan and America have their stakes in, because Pakistan has been a frontline, allied state with USA since 2001, despite all the things aside. But yes, this is good to see from a Pakistani point of view that, okay, fine, in the peace talks, and now that Abdullah is also visiting Pakistan, and okay, fine, Pakistan has a space to negotiate its own stakes in future of peace in Afghanistan. But I really cannot understand where, as a student of international politics, seriously, where does Qatar come in? Does it have a stake in Afghanistan, or why the office of a Taliban is in Doha and the discussions are taking place there? Pakistani foreign minister is going there, and then Pompeo also. So how do we relate Qatar with Taliban?
I think you have to understand their role here as having more to do with the politics of the Gulf.
Okay.
and this is true not just for Afghanistan in these negotiations, but in so many other areas where their position is different than UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
So they have wanted to have an independence from the others. They have carved out an independent foreign policy. It fits perfectly into their scheme of things to play the kind of role that they're playing now, to gain prestige from doing so. And they've succeeded in doing that. So, but as far as they're having any strategic interests in what happens, not really. Saudi Arabia does, in the sense that if the outcome were to benefit Iran, then they would be concerned, and that's their connection here. But that again has nothing so much to do with what happens in Afghanistan, but what happens geostrategically in the region.
Okay, got it. So it wants a kind of, it wants to add to its own agential power as a state from the region,
carve out itself an autonomous position in the region, and it has done this in so many other ways, in recognition and it could be negative also. UAE recognizes now Israel. Qatar will not. Qatar will not.
That's an interesting, when UAE recognizes Israel, that's a state recognizing a state, which is already recognized by international community. So there is a religious ideological difference. But recognition of Taliban and allowing their office, this is where my question was coming from. Giving them office or place was giving a legitimacy to a violent radical group in international community, which is shunned by everyone, and it has committed crimes, and even the government where it is based in Afghanistan, even that government is against it. The government is kind of done with Taliban, and that's why we are having the power sharing debate between the interest groups in Afghanistan. So this is why I was curious that why the agential power getting from a non-state terrorist group. So I was just trying to, understand the logic of that government, Qatar government. But
there's one other element here, if I may. There's one other element, and that is the international community is desperate for some kind of settlement in Afghanistan.
Yes, obviously, they do. Yeah. They do,
and they are under illusions here as to whether the Taliban are interested in what they're interested in. They're interested in a constitutional, democratic government. They assume, and one which will, amalgamate the Taliban into the mix. It will take it in, and so on. The Taliban want, and they've always indicated, we want to be dominant. We don't have to be exclusive. The others can join in as long as it's on our terms. Now, as far as Doha is concerned and Qatar's position, Qatar offered an opportunity here to do what the international community wanted so much, and that is to get to a position of a settlement through negotiations. For that, you need a neutral place.
Yes. Got it.
And what Qatar gave here was to say, look, we have no dog in the fight.
Yes. And this is where Qatar comes in.
And so we push them. The U.S. doesn't want to see it to take place in Beijing or Moscow. Maybe they care less whether it was Istanbul. But Doha offered an ideal place. That's why the U.S. and the Taliban met there. And why they're meeting there now is the first round of these discussions, assuming there will be a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth. But we're looking at a slow realization here of what the Taliban want. And that's not a government in which they can have so many cabinet positions and run as a political party. They've never misled us on that score. They've always said, what we want here is a Sharia state. And a Sharia state has to be ruled by an emir not by an elected president. And it is a Islamic council that decides on legislation, or at least controls ultimately legislation. It is not a Walisi Jirga, Nishan Road Jirga.
Right. Yeah. Like neither the tribal one nor the democratic one. What they want is what, they tried to implement back in 90s. And I think this is what would be a nightmare for the allied forces, America, or the stakeholders, or above all Pakistan.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Dr. Marvin. I'm just looking at the clock, and it's
Yes,
like
okay,
I'm so
we
disappointed.
just touched the surface here.
Yeah, exactly, because like I had questions about the state building and that and then political economy of the two countries. But I would request you to please spare some time in future, join us back again,
Another
because
time, inshallah.
it's such a learning thing to get in talk with you. Thank you so much. It was great having you. It was really an honor to talk to you. Have a great day.
My pleasure.
Thank you.